An organization determines which risks require immediate attention based on business impact. Which concept is being applied? Options are risk tolerance, risk prioritization, risk acceptance, risk transfer. In this scenario, the organization evaluates different risks and decides which ones need immediate attention by looking at their impact on the business. Let's quickly understand the options. Risk tolerance is about how much risk the organization is willing to accept overall. Risk acceptance means choosing to live with a risk without taking action, and risk transfer involves shifting the risk to another party, such as insurance. However, when an organization compares risks and ranks them based on business impact to decide what should be addressed first, this process is called risk prioritization. Therefore, the correct answer is risk prioritization, because the organization is clearly focusing on business impact to determine urgency. Risk tolerance is best defined as options are the total number of risks identified, the level of risk an organization is willing to accept, the process of eliminating risk, the likelihood of a threat occurring. Risk tolerance refers to how much risk an organization is comfortable taking while pursuing its business goals. It does not mean identifying all risks, eliminating risks completely, or measuring how likely a threat is to occur. Instead, it defines the acceptable level of risk the organization is willing to live with before taking action. Therefore, the best definition of risk tolerance is the level of risk an organization is willing to accept. Which activity should occur first in the risk management process? Options are risk assessment, risk identification, risk treatment, risk monitoring. In the risk management process, the first step is to identify risks. This means recognizing what could go wrong, such as threats, vulnerabilities, or events that may impact the organization. Without knowing what risks exist, it is not possible to assess them, decide how to treat them, or monitor them. Risk assessment comes after identification to analyze impact and likelihood. Risk treatment focuses on reducing or handling the risks, and risk monitoring is an ongoing activity after controls are in place. Therefore, the activity that should occur first is risk identification. Identifying assets, threats, and vulnerabilities is part of options are risk identification, risk assessment, risk mitigation, risk acceptance. Identifying assets, threats, and vulnerabilities is part of risk identification, because this step focuses on understanding what needs protection, what could cause harm, and where weaknesses exist. Before an organization can analyze or reduce risk, it must first clearly identify these elements. Risk assessment evaluates impact and likelihood. Risk mitigation reduces risk, and risk acceptance means choosing to live with a risk. Therefore, the correct answer is risk identification. Evaluating the likelihood and impact of a risk is known as options are risk identification, risk assessment, risk prioritization, risk transfer. Evaluating how likely a risk is to occur and how much damage it could cause is called risk assessment. In this step, risks that have already been identified are analyzed to understand their likelihood and impact. Risk identification focuses on finding risks. Risk prioritization ranks risks based on severity, and risk transfer shifts risk to another party. Therefore, the correct answer is risk assessment. An organization decides to implement encryption to reduce data breach impact. Which risk treatment option is this? Options are risk avoidance, risk mitigation, risk acceptance, risk transfer. Here, the organization is not stopping the activity or ignoring the risk. Instead, it is adding a security control encryption to reduce the impact of a possible data breach. This action is called risk mitigation, which means taking steps to lower the likelihood or impact of a risk. Risk avoidance would mean eliminating the activity entirely. Risk acceptance would mean taking no action, and risk transfer would mean shifting the risk to another party, such as through insurance. Therefore, the correct answer is risk mitigation. Purchasing cyber insurance is an example of. Options are risk avoidance, risk mitigation, risk acceptance, risk transfer. Purchasing cyber insurance means the organization is shifting the financial impact of a cyber risk to another party, in this case, the insurance provider. This is known as risk transfer. The risk itself still exists, but the responsibility for handling the loss is shared or moved. Risk avoidance would mean stopping the risky activity, risk mitigation would reduce the risk through controls, and risk acceptance would mean choosing to live with the risk. Therefore, the correct answer is risk transfer. Choosing to discontinue a risky business activity represents. Options are risk mitigation, risk acceptance, risk avoidance, risk transfer. When an organization chooses to stop or discontinue a risky business activity, it is completely removing the risk instead of trying to reduce or manage it. This approach is called risk avoidance. Risk mitigation reduces the impact or likelihood of a risk, risk acceptance means living with the risk, and risk transfer shifts the risk to another party. Therefore, the correct answer is risk avoidance. Accepting a low-impact risk without additional controls is known as. Options are risk transfer, risk avoidance, risk acceptance, risk mitigation. When a risk has a low impact and the organization decides not to implement additional controls, it is choosing to live with that risk. This approach is known as risk acceptance. Risk mitigation would involve adding controls to reduce the risk. Risk avoidance would mean stopping the activity entirely, and risk transfer would involve shifting the risk to another party. Therefore, the correct answer is risk acceptance. What is residual risk? Options are risk before controls are applied, risk eliminated by controls, risk remaining after controls are applied, risk transferred to another party. Residual risk is the amount of risk that still exists even after security controls or safeguards have been implemented. Controls can reduce risk, but they usually cannot remove it completely. Risk before controls are applied is known as inherent risk. Risk eliminated by controls is not realistic in most cases, and risk transferred to another party refers to risk transfer. Therefore, the correct answer is risk remaining after controls are applied. Which risk exists before any controls are implemented? Options are residual risk, inherent risk, transferred risk, accepted risk. Inherent risk is the level of risk that exists before any security controls or safeguards are put in place. It represents the natural risk associated with an activity or system. Residual risk is what remains after controls are applied. Transferred risk is shifted to another party, and accepted risk is a decision to live with the risk. Therefore, the correct answer is inherent risk. Why is risk prioritization important? Options are to eliminate all risks, to allocate resources effectively, to meet audit requirements only, to replace security controls. Risk prioritization is important because organizations have limited time, budget, and resources. By ranking risks based on their impact and likelihood, organizations can focus first on the most critical risks instead of trying to address everything at once. It does not eliminate all risks, is not only for audit purposes, and does not replace security controls. Therefore, the correct answer is to allocate resources effectively. Who should define an organization's risk tolerance? Options are end users, security analysts, senior management, external attackers. Risk tolerance defines how much risk an organization is willing to accept while achieving its business objectives. This decision affects strategy, finances, and overall direction, so it must be set by senior management, who are responsible for business outcomes and accountability. End users and security analysts provide input, but they do not set tolerance levels, and external attackers have no role at all. Therefore, the correct answer is senior management. Which factor most influences risk priorities? Options are number of employees, business impact, type of technology, brand reputation. Risk priorities are mainly influenced by how much damage a risk could cause to the organization if it occurs. Business impact looks at effects such as financial loss, operational disruption, legal issues, and reputation damage. The number of employees or type of technology alone does not determine urgency, and brand reputation is only one part of overall impact. Therefore, the factor that most influences risk priorities is business impact. Risk management is best described as options are a one-time task, a compliance-only activity, an ongoing continuous process, a technical control. Risk management is not something that is done once and forgotten. Threats, vulnerabilities, and business conditions change over time, so risks must be continuously identified, assessed, treated, and monitored. It is not only for compliance, and it is not a single technical control. Therefore, risk management is best described as an ongoing continuous process. Which activity determines whether a risk exceeds tolerance levels? Options are risk identification, risk assessment, risk treatment, risk monitoring. Risk assessment evaluates each identified risk by analyzing its likelihood and impact. These results are then compared against the organization's risk tolerance levels to determine whether the risk is acceptable or requires treatment. Risk identification finds risks, risk treatment addresses risks, and risk monitoring tracks risks over time. Therefore, the activity that determines whether a risk exceeds tolerance levels is risk assessment. Which step involves selecting how to address identified risks? Options are risk identification, risk assessment, risk treatment, risk prioritization. After risks are identified and assessed, the organization must decide what action to take for each risk. This decision-making step, choosing options such as mitigation, avoidance, transfer, or acceptance, is called risk treatment. Risk identification finds risks. Risk assessment analyzes their likelihood and impact, and risk prioritization ranks them by importance. Therefore, the correct answer is risk treatment. Which option best aligns with risk tolerance? Options are eliminating all risks, accepting some risk to achieve business goals, ignoring risk completely, only transferring risk. Risk tolerance defines how much risk an organization is willing to accept while pursuing its objectives. Organizations cannot eliminate all risks, and ignoring risks is not realistic or responsible. Risk tolerance allows leadership to accept certain risks when they are necessary to achieve business goals, as long as those risks remain within acceptable limits. Transferring risk is only one possible option, not the definition of tolerance. Therefore, the correct answer is accepting some risk to achieve business goals. Risk monitoring is performed to options are identify new assets, ensure controls remain effective, transfer risks, avoid compliance requirements. Risk monitoring is performed to continuously check whether implemented controls are still working as intended and whether risk levels have changed over time. It helps organizations detect new threats, control failures, or increased risk. Risk monitoring does not focus on identifying new assets, transferring risks, or avoiding compliance. Therefore, the correct answer is ensure controls remain effective. A risk register is most commonly used during MOST. Options are risk identification and tracking, incident response, security operations, user training, A risk register is a document used to record identified risks and track them over time, including details such as risk description, impact, likelihood, owner, and treatment status. It is primarily used during risk identification and ongoing tracking throughout the risk management process. It is not an incident response tool, a security operations tool, or a user training activity. Therefore, the correct answer is risk identification and tracking. Which scenario demonstrates poor risk management? Options are accepting low-impact risk, prioritizing critical systems, ignoring known high-impact risks, reviewing risk regularly. Poor risk management occurs when serious risks are known but not addressed. Ignoring high-impact risks can lead to major financial, operational, or reputational damage. Accepting low-impact risks can be reasonable. Prioritizing critical systems is good practice, and regularly reviewing risks is part of effective risk management. Therefore, the scenario that demonstrates poor risk management is ignoring known high-impact risks. Which risk response reduces the likelihood of a threat? Options are risk acceptance, risk mitigation, risk transfer, risk avoidance. Risk mitigation focuses on reducing how likely a threat is to occur or how much impact it can cause by applying security controls such as firewalls, monitoring, or access restrictions. Risk acceptance means choosing to live with the risk. Risk transfer shifts responsibility to another party, and risk avoidance removes the activity completely. Therefore, the risk response that reduces the likelihood of a threat is risk mitigation. Which role is responsible for approving risk acceptance decisions? Options are help desk, security analyst, senior management, end users. Risk acceptance means choosing to live with a risk that could impact the organization. Because this decision can affect business objectives, finances, and reputation, it must be approved by senior management, who have the authority and accountability to accept risk on behalf of the organization. Help desk staff, security analysts, and end users may identify or analyze risks, but they do not have the authority to approve risk acceptance. Therefore, the correct answer is senior management. Which element helps compare risks against each other? Options are risk tolerance, risk prioritization, risk avoidance, risk transfer. Risk prioritization helps an organization compare risks with one another by ranking them based on factors such as impact and likelihood. This allows decision makers to understand which risks are more critical and need attention first. Risk tolerance defines acceptable risk levels. Risk avoidance eliminates risk by stopping an activity, and risk transfer shifts risk to another party. Therefore, the correct answer is risk prioritization. Which action best reflects risk monitoring? Options are installing new controls, reviewing risk reports periodically, accepting residual risk, identifying new assets. Risk monitoring involves ongoing observation and review of risks and controls over time to ensure they remain effective and that risk levels have not changed. Regularly reviewing risk reports helps identify trends, control failures, or emerging risks. Installing new controls is part of risk treatment, accepting residual risk is a decision, and identifying new assets is part of risk identification. Therefore, the correct answer is reviewing risk reports periodically. Why can risk never be completely eliminated? Options are controls are too expensive, threats constantly evolve, risk management is optional, policies are ineffective. Risk can never be completely eliminated because threats, technologies, and attack methods are always changing. Even with strong controls in place, new vulnerabilities and threats can emerge over time. Cost, policies, or optional processes are not the main reason risk remains. Therefore, the correct answer is threats constantly evolve. Which statement about risk tolerance is true? Options are: it is the same for all organizations, It is defined by attackers. It varies based on business objectives. It eliminates residual risk. Risk tolerance is influenced by an organization's business goals, industry, regulatory requirements, and leadership decisions. Because these factors differ from one organization to another, risk tolerance is not the same for all organizations. It is defined by management, not attackers, and it does not eliminate residual risk. Therefore, the true statement is risk tolerance varies based on business objectives. Which factor most affects risk assessment results? Options are likelihood and impact, number of controls, employee count, system uptime. Risk assessment focuses on analyzing how likely a risk is to occur and how much damage it could cause. These two factors, likelihood and impact, directly determine the severity of a risk. The number of controls, employee count, or system uptime may influence risk indirectly, but they do not define assessment results. Therefore, the factor that most affects risk assessment results is likelihood and impact. Which approach balances security with business needs? Options are zero risk approach, risk-based approach, compliance-only approach, technology-only approach. A risk-based approach focuses on applying security controls based on the level of risk and business impact, ensuring that protection efforts support business objectives without unnecessary restrictions. A zero-risk approach is unrealistic. A compliance-only approach focuses only on meeting regulations, and a technology-only approach ignores business context. Therefore, the approach that best balances security with business needs is the risk-based approach. Why is documenting risk decisions important? Options are to replace controls, to ensure accountability and consistency, to eliminate audits, to avoid governance. Documenting risk decisions is important because it clearly records who made the decision, why it was made, and how it aligns with business objectives. This ensures accountability, supports consistent decision-making over time, and helps during audits or reviews. It does not replace security controls, eliminate audits, or avoid governance. Therefore, the correct answer is to ensure accountability and consistency. A company deploys software that automatically blocks malicious IP addresses based on threat intelligence feeds. Which type of control is being used? Options are a system-enforced protection using technology, a management-directed rule, a facility-based safeguard, a post-incident recovery mechanism. In this scenario, a company uses software that automatically blocks malicious IPs from threat intelligence feeds. This means the protection is actively carried out by a technical system, not by a person manually following a rule. It prevents attacks before they happen, so it's not physical security or a recovery step after an incident. Since the control is implemented and executed automatically by technology, the correct answer is a system-enforced protection using technology. An organization requires all employees to complete annual security awareness training. This is an example of options are a people-focused control defined by management, a software-based enforcement mechanism, a facility protection measure, a detective mechanism. In this scenario, the organization requires employees to complete annual security awareness training. This control targets the behavior and knowledge of the staff, not a piece of software or a physical barrier. It is mandated by the organization's leadership as a policy, since it aims to influence human action and reduce risk through education and is directed by management policy. The correct answer is a people-focused control defined by management. Man-traps are installed at the entrance of a secure data center. What is the primary purpose of this control? Options are to log security events, to physically prevent tailgating, to define acceptable behavior, to encrypt sensitive data. In this scenario, man-traps are installed at a secure data center entrance. A man-trap is a physical security system, often a small space with two interlocking doors that controls and restricts entry. Its core function is to ensure only one person can enter at a time and to prevent an unauthorized person from following closely behind an authorized person. While logging may be a secondary feature, its primary built-in purpose is to physically stop tailgating. Therefore, the correct answer is to physically prevent tailgating. Which control is most effective in preventing unauthorized access to systems over the Internet? Options are physical barriers, written procedures, network-based filtering mechanisms, employee background checks. In this scenario, we are looking for the most effective control at preventing unauthorized access over the Internet. This means we are focused on the digital entry point, not the physical one. Physical barriers and background checks are important, but they don't directly stop an online attack. Written procedures guide behavior, but don't automatically enforce rules. Network-based filtering mechanisms, like firewalls and intrusion prevention systems, are specifically designed to inspect Internet traffic and actively block unauthorized connection attempts before they reach internal systems. Therefore, the correct answer is network-based filtering mechanisms. An organization defines rules for password complexity and account lockout thresholds. These requirements are best classified as options are high-level strategic objectives, mandatory management rules supporting security, facility-based protections, incident handling mechanisms. In this scenario, the organization is defining specific, enforceable rules like password complexity and lockout thresholds. These are not broad strategic goals or physical safeguards. They are detailed, mandatory policies set by management that staff must follow to support the overall security of the organization's systems. They directly guide and control user behavior to prevent unauthorized access. Therefore, these requirements are best classified as mandatory management rules supporting security. A badge system records every entry and exit from an office building. This control is primarily intended to options are deter and restrict physical access, educate employees, encrypt communications, define corporate policy. In this scenario, a badge system records entries and exits. While logging creates an audit trail, the primary reason for having such a system is to control and manage who is allowed to enter the building and when. The badge reader acts as a gatekeeper that deters unauthorized entry by requiring credentials and physically restricts access to those who don't have them. Its main purpose is physical security, not education, encryption, or policy definition. Therefore, the correct answer is deter and restrict physical access. Which control relies most on human compliance rather than automation? Options are intrusion prevention system, security policy enforcement, biometric authentication, disk encryption. In this scenario, we are looking for the control that depends the most on people following the rules rather than a system automatically enforcing them. An intrusion prevention system, biometric scanner, and disk encryption all operate automatically. They either block, verify, or encrypt without asking for human permission each time. In contrast, a security policy is a set of documented rules and guidelines. Its effectiveness relies entirely on employees reading, understanding, and voluntarily complying with its instructions. Therefore, the control that relies most on human compliance is security policy enforcement. A company deploys endpoint detection software on employee laptops. This control operates mainly at which layer? Options are human behavior, physical environment, technology infrastructure, corporate governance. In this scenario, endpoint detection software is installed directly on employee laptops. This means the protective control is running on the individual computing devices, the laptops themselves, that make up the company's network. It's a technical tool designed to monitor and analyze activity on those devices. It does not primarily change human behavior, secure the physical office, or set high-level corporate rules. Therefore, this control operates mainly at the technology infrastructure layer. Security cameras are installed to discourage unauthorized behavior. Which control characteristic is most relevant here? Options are corrective, deterrent, recovery, compensating. In this scenario, security cameras are installed to discourage unauthorized behavior. This describes their primary psychological effect. The visible presence of cameras is intended to make a potential wrongdoer think twice before acting, thereby preventing an incident from happening in the first place. They are not primarily for fixing problems after they occur, corrective, restoring operations, recovery, or substituting for another failed control, compensating. Their main purpose is to prevent incidents by creating a fear of detection. Therefore, the most relevant control characteristic is deterrent. Which scenario best represents a physical control failure? Options are: an employee ignores password policy, a firewall rule is misconfigured, a door lock is broken, a patch is missing. In this scenario, we are looking for a failure of a physical control. This means the security mechanism that failed must be one that protects a tangible real-world asset or space. An ignored password policy is a human policy failure. A misconfigured firewall and a missing software patch are both technical or logical failures in the digital realm. A broken door lock, however, is a clear failure of a physical security device designed to control access to a facility. Therefore, the scenario that best represents a physical control failure is: a door lock is broken. Change management documentation is primarily intended to: options are: ensure consistency and accountability, physically protect assets, automatically block attacks, detect intrusions. In this scenario, change management documentation is a formal process for tracking, approving, and recording modifications to systems or procedures. Its primary purpose is to create a reliable, auditable record. This ensures that changes are made consistently without introducing errors or security gaps and holds people accountable for the changes they implement. It is not a tool for physical security, automatic blocking, or intrusion detection. Therefore, change management documentation is primarily intended to ensure consistency and accountability. Which control would most likely be reviewed during a compliance audit? Options are: security awareness policy, firewall throughput capacity, door hinge quality, server CPU utilization. In this scenario, we are determining what a compliance audit would most likely review. A compliance audit checks whether an organization follows specific established rules, regulations, and standards, like ISO 27001, NIST, or HIPAA. These standards almost always require documented policies, such as a security awareness policy, to prove that management has defined and communicated its security expectations. While technical metrics like firewall throughput or server CPU are important for performance, they are not the primary evidence of formal policy compliance. Door hinge quality is a facility detail, not a standard audit focus. Therefore, the control most likely to be reviewed is security awareness policy. A company enforces role-based access using software permissions. This is an example of: options are a logical enforcement mechanism, a procedural safeguard, a facility-based barrier, a recovery control. In this scenario, a company uses software permissions to enforce who can access what based on their job role. This control is applied within the digital systems through software settings and configurations to create logical boundaries and restrictions on data and functions. It is not a written procedure people follow, a physical barrier like a locked door, or a process for restoring systems after an incident. It is a technical rule enforced automatically by the system. Therefore, this is an example of a logical enforcement mechanism. Which control is designed to protect equipment from environmental threats like fire? Options are Access Control List, Fire Suppression System, Security Policy, Intrusion Detection Software. In this scenario, we are looking for a control that specifically protects equipment from environmental threats like fire. An access control list is a digital permissions rule. A security policy is a set of management rules. Intrusion detection software monitors for cyber attacks. None of these address a physical threat like a fire. A fire suppression system, however, is engineered and installed in a facility to automatically detect and extinguish flames, directly protecting physical equipment from that environmental danger. Therefore, the correct control is Fire Suppression System. Which type of control is most dependent on leadership approval and enforcement? Options are technical, administrative, physical, environmental. In this scenario, we are looking for the control type that most relies on leadership to approve its rules and ensure they are followed. Technical controls, like firewalls, and physical controls, like locks, are tools that are implemented and then often run automatically. Environmental controls, like HVAC, are engineered systems. Administrative controls, however, are the policies, procedures, and standards that govern how the organization operates. For these to be effective, senior leadership must formally approve them to give them authority and must actively enforce them through oversight and culture. Without this top-down mandate, administrative controls have no power. Therefore, the control type most dependent on leadership is administrative. An organization uses fences, lighting, and guards around its campus. These controls primarily protect. Options are information confidentiality, physical assets and personnel, logical system access, user awareness. In this scenario, an organization uses fences, lighting, and guards. These are all physical security controls installed in the real world around a facility. Their direct, tangible purpose is to create a secure perimeter, deter unauthorized entry, and protect the buildings, equipment, and people inside from physical threats like theft, vandalism, or trespassing. They do not directly protect digital information, confidentiality, control software access, or raise user awareness. Therefore, these controls primarily protect physical assets and personnel. Which control helps ensure employees understand acceptable and unacceptable actions? Options are firewall configuration, security policy, door locks, antivirus signature. In this scenario, we are looking for a control that defines and communicates acceptable and unacceptable actions for employees. A firewall, door lock, or antivirus software are all technical or physical tools that automatically enforce rules. They don't teach or explain expectations to people. A security policy, however, is a formal document created by management that outlines the rules, standards, and expected behaviors for the organization. It is the primary tool for educating staff on what they should and should not do. Therefore, the control that helps ensure employees understand these actions is security policy. Which scenario best illustrates a technical control supporting availability? Options are backup power generators, written disaster recovery plans, server load balancing software, employee evacuation drills. In this scenario, we are looking for the best example of a technical control that supports availability, meaning it helps keep systems up and running. Backup power generators are a physical or environmental control. Written plans and evacuation drills are administrative or procedural controls. Server load balancing software, however, is a technology-based solution that automatically distributes network traffic across multiple servers. This prevents any single server from being overwhelmed, which maintains performance and uptime for users. It is a technical mechanism directly ensuring system availability. Therefore, the best illustration is server load balancing software. Why are administrative controls considered foundational? Options are They directly stop attacks. They guide behavior and decision-making. They replace physical security. They encrypt sensitive data. In this scenario, we are explaining why administrative controls are considered foundational. Administrative controls are the policies, procedures, and standards set by management. They don't directly stop an attack like a firewall does, replace physical locks, or encrypt data automatically. Instead, they form the essential framework and rules that guide how people behave, make decisions, and implement all other security measures. Every technical and physical control is built upon the authority and direction provided by these administrative rules. Therefore, they are foundational because they guide behavior and decision-making. Which control would most directly prevent unauthorized entry into a server room? Options are Access Control Policy, Security Guard Verification, Antivirus Software, Audit Logging. In this scenario, we are looking for the control that most directly prevents unauthorized entry into a physical space, the server room. An access control policy is a rule on paper. Antivirus software protects against malware. Audit logging records events after they happen. While a security guard also verifies identity, the policy itself doesn't physically stop entry. However, security guard verification is a direct, real-time, physical interaction where a person checks credentials and physically blocks or allows entry at the door. This is the most immediate and direct preventive measure at the point of entry. Therefore, the correct answer is security guard verification. A system automatically terminates inactive user sessions. This is best classified as options are a user awareness control, a technical enforcement mechanism, a physical safeguard, a recovery control. In this scenario, a system automatically terminates inactive user sessions. This action is performed by the system's software or configuration without requiring a user to remember to log out. It's a rule enforced directly by technology to limit access and reduce risk. It's not dependent on user awareness, it's not a physical lock, and it's not restoring systems after an incident. Therefore, this is best classified as a technical enforcement mechanism. Which control type is most difficult to enforce consistently? Options are automated technical controls, physical barriers, administrative rules dependent on human behavior, environmental protections. In this scenario, we are looking for the control type that is most difficult to enforce consistently. Automated technical controls, physical barriers, and environmental protections all operate based on set rules or engineering once installed. They work the same way every time. Administrative rules, however, are policies and procedures that rely entirely on people reading, understanding, remembering, and voluntarily following them. Human behavior is variable. People can forget, misinterpret, or choose to ignore a rule, making consistent enforcement a constant challenge that requires oversight and culture. Therefore, the most difficult to enforce consistently is administrative rules dependent on human behavior. Which example best demonstrates layered security controls? Options are using only policies, combining guards, access cards, and authentication systems, relying on antivirus alone, installing security cameras only. In this scenario, the concept is layered security, also known as defense in depth. This means using multiple, diverse types of controls so that if one fails, another is there to provide protection. Relying on only one type of control, whether it's just policies, just antivirus, or just cameras, creates a single point of failure. Combining guards, a physical, people control, access cards, a physical, technical control, and authentication systems, a technical control, creates multiple defensive barriers across different categories: physical, technical, administrative. This is the classic, most effective demonstration of a layered security approach. Therefore, the best example is combining guards, access cards, and authentication systems, Which control is most effective for deterring casual attackers? Options are encryption algorithms, warning signs and surveillance cameras, complex policies, incident response plans. In this scenario, we are looking for the control most effective at deterring casual attackers like opportunistic trespassers or vandals. These attackers typically avoid risk and will move on if a target looks secure or they believe they will be caught. Encryption and complex policies protect data and set rules, but they aren't visible deterrents. Incident response plans are for handling attacks after they happen. Warning signs and surveillance cameras are highly visible. They create the immediate psychological perception of increased risk and likelihood of being observed or identified, which is what directly discourages a casual attacker from even attempting an intrusion. Therefore, the most effective deterrent is warning signs and surveillance cameras. A company uses encryption keys stored in a hardware security module. This control is primarily options are administrative, technical, physical, procedural. In this scenario, a company is using a hardware security module, HSM, to store encryption keys. An HSM is a specialized physical computing device, but its core function is to perform the technical cryptographic operations of generating, storing, and managing encryption keys in a highly secure, tamper-resistant manner. This is fundamentally about implementing and enforcing a technical security mechanism for data protection. While it has a physical housing, its primary classification is as a security technology that enforces confidentiality. Therefore, this control is primarily technical. Which control would most likely reduce insider threats caused by negligence? Options are physical fencing, security awareness training, firewall tuning, server redundancy. In this scenario, we are looking for the control most likely to reduce insider threats caused by negligence. This means threats that happen because employees make honest mistakes, like falling for a phishing email or mishandling data. Physical fencing prevents unauthorized entry. Firewall tuning protects the network perimeter. Server redundancy maintains uptime. Security awareness training, however, directly targets the human factor. It educates employees on security risks and proper procedures, making them more vigilant and less likely to make careless errors. Therefore, the control that most directly addresses negligent insider threats is security awareness training. Which control type ensures long-term consistency across departments? Options are technical, administrative, physical, environmental. In this scenario, ensuring long-term consistency across different departments means creating a unified set of rules and standards that everyone follows over time. Technical controls are specific to systems, physical controls are location-based, and environmental controls manage facilities. Administrative controls, the documented policies, procedures, and standards approved by management, are specifically designed to provide a common framework. They establish the same expectations for all departments, ensuring everyone operates under the same security rules and processes consistently into the future. Therefore, the control type that ensures this long-term, organization-wide consistency is administrative. Which scenario best represents misuse of a technical control? Options are policy not communicated, firewall disabled by administrator, door left unlocked, employee skips training. In this scenario, we are looking for the best example of misusing a technical control. A technical control is a security mechanism implemented through technology, like software or hardware. A policy not being communicated is a procedural failure. A door left unlocked is a physical security failure. An employee skipping training is a human resources or compliance issue. A firewall disabled by an administrator, however, is a direct example of a person, someone with authorized access, intentionally or negligently deactivating a core piece of security technology, thereby misusing their administrative power and undermining the technical safeguard. Therefore, the best representation is firewall disabled by administrator. Which control focuses on preventing damage to infrastructure rather than data? Options are encryption. Backup procedures. Environmental sensors. Security policies. In this scenario, we are looking for a control that focuses on preventing damage to infrastructure, meaning the physical hardware, servers, and facilities, rather than protecting the data itself. Encryption protects data confidentiality. Backup procedures protect data availability and recovery. Security policies are broad guidelines. Environmental sensors, like those monitoring temperature, humidity, or water leaks, are designed to detect physical conditions that could damage or destroy the hardware infrastructure. By alerting staff to these hazards, they help prevent physical damage before it occurs. Therefore, the correct control is environmental sensors. Why are multiple types of security controls necessary? Options are: no single control addresses all risks. Technical controls are expensive. Policies are optional. Physical controls are outdated. In this scenario, the fundamental reason for using multiple types of controls like administrative, technical, and physical together is based on risk management. Different controls address different kinds of threats. A firewall can't stop someone from walking into a server room, and a security policy can't automatically encrypt data. Relying on just one type leaves gaps. The correct explanation is that no single control addresses all risks. This layered approach, called defense in depth, ensures that if one control fails, another is there to provide protection